Welcome to the 9th lecture for Between War and Peace. In last week's lecture, we examined the issues around cyber war, cybersecurity, the arguments for and against going to cyber war, some of the potential problems, issues such as the threshold problem, attribution problem. That was the last week on the alternatives themselves. This week, we step back to consider the ethics of the alternatives in light of major recent events and shifts in the international order. We focus on the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic and the challenges that this brings to the forefront. In doing so, we consider the potential move towards a post-liberal order and the ramifications for the frameworks that we've looked at, such as for the responsibility to protect, the R2P, and for just war theory with war. Now, there's an awful lot that might be covered by the ramifications of COVID-19. We're going to limit ourselves to two issues, both of which concern the broader context within the alternatives to war might be undertaken. The first is the potential decline, move towards the post-liberal order and the decline of the West. As we'll see, it might be thought that the COVID-19 pandemic will speed up the decline and shift us more quickly towards a post-liberal order. On the other hand, it might also be thought that the pandemic will only re-entrench existing power and do little to shift the fundamentals of global order. As we will see, all of this matters because, to a certain extent, the case for the alternatives depends on current norms in the international system being influential. And these norms in turn depend on the underlying international order that we're in. Don't worry about taking this in for a minute. Just now, I'm going to explain it in today's lecture, just to signal this is where we're going today. The second major issue that we're going to look at, and this will be in part 2, is what we can all call issues of prioritization, sometimes called priority setting. This is about how states should prioritize between their various global responsibilities when it's not possible for them to meet all of their various responsibilities. So for instance, should they focus on tackling global poverty or going to war to tackle mass atrocities? This has, it seems, been highlighted by and exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, as we're going to look at in today's lecture. As we will see, it seems likely that states are going to face far fewer resources to tackle international crises and will have to choose very carefully whether they should, as I've already alluded to, tackle mass atrocities by going to war, or fight global poverty, or fight terrorism, or improve global health. And this in turn influences whether going to war is likely to be a desirable option in the future, as well as the pursuit of many of the alternatives. Are they going to be desirable options in the future? So for instance, if it's the case that states shouldn't prioritize mass atrocities or shouldn't prioritize tackling aggression, but instead focus on planning for future pandemics, this might further reduce the case for launching economic sanctions or going to war or naming and shaming and so on. Again, don't worry for now about taking all of this in, just to signal where we're going today. Okay, let's start then with part 1. To understand this, we need to first understand say a little bit about the liberal order. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've been living under a liberal order dominated by the US and a series of institutions that the US has played a significant role in constructing and in maintaining. These include the World Trade Organization, the WTO, the World Bank, to some degree the UN. The end of the Soviet Union meant that the main opposition to liberalism diminished and liberal ideology became predominant. It was famously even claimed that there was the end of history, that liberalism had won by Francis Fukuyama. we've seen over the past 3 to 4 decades a significant rise in the number of democracies worldwide, declining conflict between states, as well as a decline in global poverty. Things haven't, of course, always been rosy. There have been lots of significant problems as well. Obviously, war in Iraq that we've touched on several times. Other ones include massive inequalities, continuing global poverty, climate change, and so on and so forth. However, it seems that now, as I mentioned in lecture 1, the BRICS states are rising. These are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. There's some debate about whether we should group all of these states together, but let's put this aside for now. The general point is that it's been very widely suggested that the BRICS states, and particularly China, are rising in influence and the West is in relative decline. It's very clear that China's economic might has increased significantly, and it's been playing an increasingly important role globally. It's also clear that there's been somewhat of a downsizing of the influence of previously influential states such as France and the UK, and even potentially the US, although this is hotly contested. That's one element of the major shift. The second element is that we've seen many supposedly and potentially even supposedly for liberal states and potentially even former liberal states such as Hungary and Poland, and arguably the US under Trump, moving away from some of the key liberal ideals. They've endorsed far-right movements, attacked human rights organizations, undermined democratic ideals, buddied up with authoritarian leaders such as Putin and Duterte in the Philippines. So there's been two major shifts related that seems like we might be moving towards a post-liberal global order. First is the rise of the BRICS, the non-Western powers, and the second is the move away from liberalism by some of the liberal order's otherwise previously key proponents. Now, there's very vigorous debates in the literature and international relations about what exactly the future will hold for us. Future of the global order is hotly contested. Some, such as John Mearsheimer, one of the most famous realists out there, predicts a very conflictual situation. Others, such as Amitav Acharya, thinks more positively that there's going to be a pluralist global order, lots of different global powers in different regions, and this, he thinks, will be desirable because we'll have a different range of viewpoints and will act as a check on some of the West's power. Others, such as Daniel Judny, John Ikenberry, are more optimistic that the liberal order will continue in perhaps in a slightly different form, but the main institutions will prevail. One point about all of these major accounts is that they were written before, of course, before the COVID-19 pandemic. How does this change things? On the one hand, we might think that COVID will help the BRICS states to rise more quickly and to move us towards a post-liberal order much more quickly. Let's call this acceleration view. It's going to accelerate this transition towards a post-liberal order. A few points here. A few points why we might support this view. The pandemic has seen Western states spend billions on lockdowns, on PPE, treatment, testing, furlough schemes, and so on. This is largely by borrowing. Their economies have been extremely badly hit, which could significantly damage their influence globally in the longer term, as they lack the financial wherewithal to be able to project their influence. The pandemic has also seen a rise in conspiracy stories, fake news, questioning the expertise of scientists, and significant curtailing of people's rights through lockdowns and restrictions. This could, the thought goes, lead to a much more authoritarian future where currently liberal governments quite like this power and hold on to it and continue to restrict their citizens' rights even when there's no justification for doing so. By contrast, this argument goes, although the virus originated in China and it was heavily criticized at the time for what was seen as a cover-up, it's taken far less of a major economic hit and a far lower death toll, at least publicly as far as we know, than many Western states. For some, it's been a model to follow, even though it's been very authoritarian in its response to the pandemic. So to some extent, we've seen a lauding of the Chinese response, and it may well be relatively better off economically. So this might suggest that the acceleration view is correct, that the COVID-19 pandemic is going to increase us more quickly towards a post-liberal order where China, potentially other non-Western states, have significant influence and the West declines in influence more quickly, and liberalism is eschewed by even some of the liberal order's previously key proponents. Now, this has implications for what we've been looking at in this module, for mass atrocities and for aggression. In lecture 1, if you remember back that far, you might recall that I presented some positive looking graphs and a positive video about the decline of conflict. This record is called the declinist thesis. It says that wars between states, intrastate wars, have been decreasing significantly and that the world has become much more peaceful. It's also been suggested that there's been a notable decrease in mass atrocities recently. However, many commentators predict that in a post-liberal order, there will be a rise in conflict. This is because first, on some views, there will be increased competition between the US and China, and this will result in even direct conflict between the two, but probably more likely the sort of proxy wars that were found across the world during the Cold War. The point that these scholars make is that when there's one power, one global power, such as the US, the hegemon, technical term, the hegemon, things are much more stable than when there is several powers, several global powers. And as we move to a post-liberal order, there will be several global powers, and at least two, the US and China, but others potentially as well. I should add here that this point is heavily contested. Some don't buy this pessimistic view of the rise of China and argue that it will rise peacefully and there's unlikely to be any major conflict between the US and China, particularly given their close economic links. Second, in a post-COVID order, the world may be far poorer. States will compete much more over resources, and this will lead to an increase in conflict between states and between rebels and states. There will be fewer resources to go around, so there will be wars, for instance, over water, over natural resources, over the things that people need to live. Third, we've already seen that one of the main responses to the pandemic has been the closure of borders and the rise in xenophobia and racism. First towards Chinese minorities around the world, and then other forms of racism and xenophobia. It follows that there could be a rise in far-right movements, and there might be more incidents of mass atrocities, as it can be very difficult for potential refugees to flee from violence, given all the high levels of border restrictions that there have been, particularly if these restrictions continue forward into the future. There will be the persecution of minorities, particularly if there's scarcity of resources, if there's not enough to go around, and the minorities are seen, for instance, as getting more than others. So many of the leading figures on R2P, some of the former special advisors to the UN Secretary General on the R2P, have worried that mass atrocities will spike further in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, given these conflicts over resources and border restrictions making it harder for refugees to flee violence. As I already said in lecture one, they've already been on the rise over the past 5 years in the aftermath of Syria and Myanmar. Now, one query here. All of this stems from a more pessimistic view of international relations, particularly from the realist view of international relations. They were pretty pessimistic to start with about the nature of the international system. It's just a continuation of an international system where states pursue power and security. As you'll see on the required reading this week, the Hoffman and Estrup Sangiovanni piece is a lot more optimistic. And to reiterate the point I've already made, many think that the rise of non-Western powers will in fact be desirable, as they will offer a different worldview or will be socialized into the pervading systems of the international community. And one might also not think that COVID-19 pandemic will have such lasting, long-term, dramatic effects. In fact, the ability of states to provide a vaccine so quickly has been remarkable, as well as the facts of states have even signed up to some degree of fairness, albeit far from being a fully fair system, some degree of fairness in ensuring that poorer states will have some degree of access to the vaccine. It could have been far worse. We've also seen the ability of states to lock down and to undertake quite remarkable measures that wouldn't have been possible to think of a year ago or so. This might give states much more confidence in tackling perhaps the biggest threat that we face, climate change. It might also galvanize efforts to make significant reforms in other fields, such as in tackling mass atrocities and aggression for the longer term. The thought here is that big traumas can lead to big political changes. For instance, after World War II, the United Nations was formed. There's another query here. Suppose we adopt a more pessimistic view of international relations. Daniel Drezner, whose piece is also on the reading list this week, adopts a fairly pessimistic view of IR. But he still thinks that the COVID-19 pandemic is not likely to fundamentally shift global politics. We can call this the little change view. He claims that the pandemic has shown that the sources of Chinese and US power without undercutting the foundations of either one. The pandemic has highlighted nationalist and protectionist tendencies in great powers. In neither dimension has COVID-19 had transformational effect. By historical standards, a minor pandemic will have minor system altering effects. A couple more points that seem relevant here. Global trade might be likely to take a significant financial hit, and those who might be hit hardest might be the lower and middle income countries in the longer run. The richer Western states might still prevail in their predominant positions, as they've tended to do despite various financial crises throughout the past 50 or 60 years. One might also think that China has been dealt a significant reputational blow by its original handling of the outbreak and its cover-up, which Drezner suggests. One might also think that given the fact that Western states are embracing a form of vaccine nationalism, even though they're distributing it, attempting to set up some sort of fair scheme of distribution, they are primarily concerned with distributing it to their own populations. This will mean that the Western economies are likely to be able to get going much more quickly again, 2021, 2022. And this will empower them to maintain their global position more quickly. So, there are lots of different views about the how the COVID-19 pandemic will impact on international order. I want to set the little change view aside for this next section of the lecture and assume that the acceleration view is right. So let's think, if we are more quickly moving to a post-liberal order, given the COVID-19 pandemic, what does this mean for the alternatives that we've been looking at and for the frameworks that underlie the alternatives? Let's start with the RTP, the responsibility to protect. As we looked at in lecture 1, the RTP is the notion that it's a responsibility to address mass atrocities. Two elements to this, remember. First is the notion of sovereignty as responsibility. This is the idea that states are required to tackle and prevent mass atrocities within their own borders. The second is the notion of an international responsibility to protect against atrocities in other states. Of these two elements, the second, the international responsibility to protect, is, according to most commentators, what's novel about the RTP. Before the RTP, there wasn't really much of a sense that states have an international responsibility to address mass atrocities beyond their borders. Yet this is the element that's perhaps most at risk in a potential post-liberal order in the aftermath of COVID. Remember in lecture 4, we looked at constructivism in II, in international relations. This holds that states are concerned with norms in international politics, such as the RTP, at least somewhat. This is because these norms influence what states see as appropriate. What's referred to as the logic of appropriateness, if you remember. And it concerns how states see their own identity. These two sorts of effects are referred to by Luke Glanville as regulative and constitutive effects. Regulative effects concern how the influence of norms, such as the responsibility to protect, have on states. The influence that norms, such as the RTP, have on states. This is through measures such as naming and shaming, sanctions, and so on. Through these measures, states are socialized into complying with norms such as the RTP in order to be seen as legitimate. In other words, they regulate their behavior. Constitutive effects concern how states understand their self-identities. They might see themselves, for instance, as liberal, democracy, rights-respecting sorts of states. So constructivists highlight the regulative and the constitutive effects of norms such as the RTP. In the post-liberal order, potentially accelerated by the pandemic, these effects could be far weaker, and so we reduce the ability of the RTP to constrain states. 3 points here. Firstly, the regulative effects. These might be far weaker. What this means is that the effects that they would have on the international responsibility to protect would influence states far less. If you recall in lecture 4, I gave the example of round buying amongst your group of friends. When pretty much everyone subscribes to round buying, there's a lot more pressure that can be exerted on your friends that don't buy rounds. But now suppose that a significant number of your friends don't agree with round buying. Most do, but a sizable number don't. It'll be much harder for you to criticize your friends for failing to engage in round buying successfully. The pressure that you could exert would be far less because there's a sizable number of individuals who don't agree with it. Likewise, as fewer states endorse the RTP, the regulative effects of the RTP would become much weaker. As states look to other forms of identities, they move away from seeing themselves as human rights liberal states that endorses the RTP. So then the influence of the RTP norm through these regulative effects would be reduced. Second, the constitutive effects would be far weaker. As previously liberal states no longer see themselves as liberal, they won't identify with the RTP. They won't step, they will potentially advance, they won't potentially advance a different understanding of their self-interest based on, say, conservatism or xenophobia. This in turn would exacerbate these regulative effects. So as fewer and fewer of your friends endorse round buying, the norm becomes weaker. It has far less power to influence your group to engage in round buying. Third, according to some predictions, international institutions in the post-liberal order may be far weaker. In other words, multilateralism will be less strong. International organizations such as the UN Security Council will reduce in power as states endorse unilateralism or work with other states that share similarly conservative or xenophobic views. As with the International Criminal Court that we looked at last week, these institutions are important for promoting the RTP as they endorse, for instance, the use of force or economic sanctions or criminal prosecutions. But if they are weaker, then states might increasingly look to unilateral measures, go outside of what the RTP requires. So the RTP could be reduced in its multilateral base, and this could undermine importance in the post-liberal order, undermine its importance in the post-liberal, post-COVID world. So these three effects suggest that the RTP could be reduced in influence. Underlying institutions underlying the RTP might be weaker. Regulative effects might be weaker. Constitutive effects about the identities might be weaker. Now, one query here is that the RTP doesn't really constrain much anyway at the start, to start with. It might be thought that states already tend to do what they want to do and overlook norms such as the RTP. Much depends on how much influence do you think that the RTP and norms in general possess. If you don't think that they possess much influence, then these concerns may not be that great, although perhaps still worrying somewhat to the extent that we want states to cohere with the duty to tackle mass atrocities. But if you do think the RTP has some degree of influence, even if not as much as one might desire, these concerns are potentially greater. Another query simply offers an alternative vision. It's that the rules of the RTP will continue to have regulative and constitutive effects. After all, the idea that there's been an international responsibility to protect has been around in various forms, even if not incarnated directly in the RTP, for quite a long time and has intuitive appeal. There's something very motivating about the fact that if there's people being killed brutally on a large scale, if your state can do something about it, it should try to. And suggested that might not be going, that feeling might not go away. Related to that, it might be that although as we understand the RTP, as we look to the intellectual one, based around the 2005 World Summit outcome, based around the three pillars, if you remember, this understanding of the RTP, that might not last forever in a post-liberal order, but there might be still some notion that states are duty bound to do something to tackle genocide, for instance. So we've seen that post-liberal order exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic could undermine the regulative effects that concern how states are constrained by norms, the constitutive effects concern the identity of norms, international institutions, particularly multilateralism. Although whether this will in fact impact on RTP depends some on whether you think the RTP is influential already, and whether there might be an alternative that could potentially arise that replaces RTP instead. Let's now turn to some of the more concrete measures that we've been looking at in this module. What would a post-liberal, post-COVID world order have for these? Let's start with week 2, war. Remember, we looked at just war theory, principles of jus ad bellum and jus in bello. And we've seen that these jus in bello codified in international law in particular ways. Most clearly, international humanitarian law provides a detailed set of restrictions of how states should conduct themselves during war. The main aim of these restrictions is to reduce the horrors of war. They emphasize the 2 central principles of jus in bello that we looked at: discrimination, which is that belligerents need to target combatants and not non-combatants, and proportionality, which limits the means that soldiers should use. Over the past few decades, there has, most commentators agree, been a decrease in the extent to which belligerents follow these principles. This is particularly as we've seen a lot more civil wars, intrastate wars, involving rebels that haven't clearly signed up to them. Indeed, there's an interesting literature on the ethics of civil wars that draws upon just war theory and considers how states should respond to rebels who don't follow the rules. Michael Gross's work in particular is relevant here. In the post-COVID, post-liberal order, it might be that the rules of jus in bello become much weaker in general, including not only for rebels, but also for states. Just as the rules of the R2P, the responsibility to protect, might reduce in their regulative and constitutive effects, the same might be true of just war theory. It might be that states no longer are pressurized into following international humanitarian law, and their identities might no longer be seen as states that are bound to follow international humanitarian law, which will reduce the power that these norms have on states. In addition, there might be much more cases of aggression, many more atrocities. So there might be more potentially just causes for war. In addition, as I've already alluded to, it might be harder to receive UN Security Council authorization if some of the multilateral institutions become weaker, and might be that unilateral measures are undertaken a lot more. So this might mean it's more difficult to receive legitimate authority. Stepping back, if opponents are less likely to follow the rules, if other states are less likely to follow the rules, or rebel groups are less likely to follow the rules, then it might seem that if we think the rules of jus in bello should be based on reciprocity, it's less required for us to follow the rules. So if we think that the reason why we shouldn't kill enemy soldiers is because if we have this rule, they'll be less likely to kill our enemy soldiers, reciprocal agreement, then if they're not following the rules, then nor should we. So it might appear then that just war theory will be less requiring, less demanding on states. Now, against this, one query here is that although the rules are already broken extensively by states and other actors, but you might still think that there's reason to follow them. Many just war theorists reject this notion of reciprocity as the underlying basis of jus in bello in particular, i.e., you should follow the rules only if others do so. They argue instead that states should follow the rules regardless of whether others follow the rules. On this view, then, the rules governing warfare would still be very demanding on states. Another query is this: as we've seen on the more positive account of the post-liberal order, post-COVID order, the world order might not necessarily be quite as conflictual or involve quite as many mass atrocities. Certain actors might be more willing to follow the rules of just war theory, jus in bello, and international institutions might still be willing to authorize wars on occasion, and so unilateralism would not necessarily predominate. Let's now turn to economic sanctions, which we looked at in week 3. there might be much more call for economic sanctions in the post-Liberal, post-COVID order. But if there are fewer willing states to go along with them, sign up to them, this might reduce their effectiveness even more. As you might remember from when we looked at in week 3, there are big debates about how effective sanctions should be. One of the issues is that states can evade sanctions. To counteract this, it's often thought that sanctions work best when they're multilateral, when you've got lots of states involved. It makes it much more difficult for the sanctioned party to evade them. It's going to be more difficult to have multilateralism, then it's going to be more difficult to maintain that sanctions will be effective. If, for instance, various states, even potentially previously liberal states, will willingly trade with regimes that are under sanctions regimes from the lingering liberal states. What about diplomacy? Well, remember that naming and shaming, which we focused on in week 4, depends on norms being influential, on people being concerned about their legitimacy. For instance, concerned about round buying, to use that analogy again. But if the regulative and constitutive effects of norms, such as R2P, will be reduced, the influence of naming and shaming on diplomatic criticism will in turn reduce. So the effectiveness of this measure could be decreased. It might also be easier to point to alternative facts and fake news about the criticisms and the crises that they highlight. Luke Glanville highlights here that even currently in our rapidly emerging post-truth age, in which assertions of inconsistency, hypocrisy, broken promises are often dismissed as fake news, the potential for the global community to be able to put in place reputational costs on states for failing to adhere to norms is already fast deteriorating. It might be the case, it might be the case in a post-liberal, post-COVID order, there'll be even more fake news, even more alternative facts, much more difficult to have naming and shaming stick to a state because other states will be able to appeal to alternative facts to get them off the hook, fake news to get them off the hook, to weaken the degree of opprobrium. Let's look at one more measure. At the moment, there's relatively scant regulation of cyber conflict. There are lots of efforts to control and regulate cyber operations, but these are highly limited. In the post-liberal order, post-conflict, post-COVID order, we might see that there's a significant spike in cyber conflict, and any attempt to try to regulate this internationally, which is sorely needed, fails. And when in this highly unregulated environment, there might be more scope potentially, because no one else is going to help you, for hacking back. Of course, depending on your view on hacking back that we looked at last week. You might also think in a post-liberal COVID order, post-COVID order, it'd be potentially justifiable to engage in offensive cyber measures in response to many more types of situations, given that the world will be far more, on some views, conflictual and many more mass atrocities ongoing. There might also be many more cyber attacks against you to which to defend against. It's also potential that cyber measures could be a lot cheaper than going to war or launching economic sanctions in the face of a COVID-19 situation where there's post-COVID-19 situation where there's very limited resources available for foreign policy spending. And this is something that states might be able to do potentially much more cheaply than some of the other measures that we've looked at in this module. There might not be a shift to a post-liberal global order. To reiterate, this is highly contested. Some predict a much more positive future. Some also predict a much more positive future about the R2P and about mass atrocities and about conflict. To add a few more points here, we have a new US administration that will start in January. Joe Biden has a relatively good track record, it seems, on mass atrocities. He spoke very vehemently against apartheid in South Africa.
Disturbs me more than the policy that you call a policy is the rationale for the policy. The rationale for the policy. You set out 4 principles that you adhere to, and then and I will go over them in a moment. Then you say on page 14, we must not become part of South Africa's problem. We must remain part of their solution. We must not aim to impose ourselves, our solutions, our favorites in South Africa. Damn it, we have favorites in South Africa. The favorites in South Africa are the people who are being repressed by that ugly white regime. We have favorites. Our loyalty is not to South Africa, it's to South Africans. And the South Africans are majority black, and they are being excoriated. It is not to some stupid puppet government over there. It is not to the Afrikaner regime. We have no loyalty to them. We have no loyalty to South Africa, to South Africans. And the fact of the matter is I listen to this rationale, first of all. It is the leaders of South Africa and their people, black and white, who have the majority responsibility. They must rise to it. Well, they are rising to it. They're rising to it. The only thing left available to them with that repulsive, repugnant regime of Afrikaners there. And it's the only way they have. They tried everything for the last 20 years. They begged, they borrowed, they crawled, and now they're taking up arms. The second thing, progress toward peace requires a timetable. Timetable, elimination of apartheid. What's our timetable? What are we saying to that repugnant regime? Are we saying you've got 20 days, 20 months, 20 years? We ask them to put up a timetable. What's our timetable? These people are being crushed. And we're sitting here with the same kind of rhetoric. The same thing we heard. We heard go slow. We heard we have to take care of the problem afterwards. We heard we can't impose.
He also was involved in campaigning for strong action in response to the mass atrocities in Bosnia. There have also been positive developments recently, despite the Trumpian world that we've been living in. We've encountered a couple of these already. The Gambia. Its authoritarian leader was deposed 3 or 4 years ago. The Sudan, where there are huge mass atrocities in Darfur. Bashir is now potentially going to go under trial to the ICC. And as we looked at a couple of weeks ago, despite all the criticism that the ICC has been getting, despite the vehement attacks on it on states such as the US, it continues on. So we might have, in fact, a far more optimistic world order that's far less detrimental to the alternatives than some of the picture that I've been painting today.